supplies across front lines in 8 states, including Khartoum. We are making significant efforts to scale up our operations, and I urge the parties to the conflict to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law to protect civilians and enable humanitarian action. Violence against aid workers and attacks on civilian infrastructure and humanitarian supplies must stop. I appeal to the parties to the conflict and the governments of neighbouring countries to do everything possible to enable humanitarian aid workers to reach all people in need, both within Sudan and across borders. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the people of Sudan and those of neighbouring countries are shouldering the burden of this terrible crisis. We must do everything we can to support them. It is not only our duty as members of the international community, it is crucial to preventing the situation from deteriorating even further. Our humanitarian agencies and their partners on the ground are ready to step up their efforts. But funding for the Sudan Humanitarian Response Plan and the Regional Refugee Response Plan do not meet the scale of this emergency. Of the 3 billion needed, less than 17% has been funded so far. I appeal to you all today to provide funding to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid and to support people living in the most difficult and dangerous conditions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the only way to end this crisis is through a return to peace and the restoration of civilian rule through the transition to democracy. Sudanese people have made their wishes very clear, and I am a true advocate for African initiatives. And so the United Nations is fully committed to support the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in their joint efforts to restore hope for a peaceful solution to this crisis. As High Commissioner for Refugees, I witnessed the enormous generosity of the Sudanese people towards hundreds of thousands of Eritreans, South Sudanese and others seeking refuge in Sudan. And I was always deeply impressed by the resilience of the Sudanese refugees I met in Chad. The United Nations stands with the courageous Sudanese people and their wishes and hopes for a better future. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you for your remarks. I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim Al Thani, Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar. You have the floor.
In the name of God, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me pleasure at the outset to welcome you all to this high-level event, important event that comes at a moment, at a very important moment that sees the exacerbation of the conflict in the Sudan. The unwavering position of Qatar is to support the territorial integrity, independence, and unity of the sisterly country of the Sudan. We reject any interference in the internal affairs of the Sudan and respect the wishes of the Sudanese people to justice and security and peace. In this respect, we highly appreciate the joint Saudi-U.S. intervention that led to a number of humanitarian truces. We also welcome the efforts of the IGAD and the African Union, and we call for the coordination between these different endeavors. There is no military solution for this conflict. The peaceful solution is the only solution for this conflict. In this respect, we call upon the parties to stop hostilities immediately and to put the aspirations of the Sudanese people in the forefront and to address the root causes of the conflict. We also call upon both parties to respect the international humanitarian law and the international human rights law that obligate both parties to respect the rights of the civilians and civilian institutions and to deliver humanitarian assistance to all without discrimination and wherever they are in line with the international legal rules. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, we all need to show solidarity with the Sudanese people to address the consequences of the humanitarian conflict they are witnessing. The state of Qatar, in this respect, has always stood firm by the sisterly people, the brotherly people of the Sudan, in terms of development and humanitarian aids, in addition to supporting efforts of stabilization in the Sudan, central to which the Darfur Peace Initiative in 2011 signed in Doha. The consequential humanitarian impacts of the current conflict led Qatar to stand by the Sudanese by providing air support with shipments, large amounts of shipment, carrying food and medication. 1,784 were evacuated by virtue of the help of the relevant institutions in Qatar. We thank the ICRC and other institutions, and we highly value our partnership with them in this respect. The unfolding conflict in Sudan requires an urgent funding to address the humanitarian gap in the Sudan and the refugees particularly. Therefore, sufficient aid must be provided to contain the conflict completely so that it would not spill over in the neighboring context. Based on our moral position and obligation towards our brothers in the Sudan, we pledge $50 million to support the humanitarian response plan and the regional refugee plan as well. Our meeting today comes at a very important juncture. All eyes of the Sudanese are fixated upon us. Therefore, we send a message of solidarity to them out of this rostrum, and we call upon the regional and international partners to provide the necessary financial pledges to mitigate the negative consequences on the people affected by the humanitarian conflict. In conclusion, the state of Qatar will spare no efforts to stand firm by the Sudanese people to overcome this crisis, and we hope that this high-level event will reach the aspirations of the brothers in the Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your remarks. I would now like to give the floor to His Highness Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to express the thanks of our government to Egypt, Germany, the EU, as well as OCHA and the UNHCR for all the efforts made to help Sudan overcome this challenge. Today, the people of Sudan look at this meeting and hope for urgent pledges that would assist them to face the difficult and dire circumstances of the day, especially with the escalation of events in Sudan. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia continues to support the people of Sudan and work on finding a political solution. We have hosted the different parties last May in order to help both parties to de-escalate the conflict. We have succeeded in cooperation with the USA to achieve the Jeddah Declaration and the various humanitarian ceasefires. The last was 2 days ago. We hope these efforts will help protect civilians and will facilitate humanitarian access. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, government and population, stemming from their belief in helping brothers, will not spare any effort to help the people of Sudan, and has done so from the beginning of the conflict. We have already given $100 million through the King Salman Center. We have also put in place various assistance corridors by air and sea. in addition to a campaign that was launched on a popular level since the beginning of the conflict, we have also evacuated our citizens from Sudan, and we were able to evacuate 845,000 persons from over 100 countries. We have also provided help through dedicated agencies in order to alleviate the suffering of the people. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has created a humanitarian center in Jeddah to provide assistance to Sudan and the region and to facilitate aerial lifting of assistance to Sudan. It is essential to provide all necessary relief and assistance and to preserve humanitarian corridors. Therefore, we must enhance the efforts in order to provide necessary support to alleviate the suffering of the people of Sudan. In conclusion, I would like to thank all those who have worked hard to convene this conference. We hope it will be successful in mobilizing the necessary assistance. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Highness, for your intervention as well as for your pledge. I also want to thank the State of Qatar for their intervention and pledge. I will now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Sameh Shoukry, Foreign Minister of Egypt. You have the floor, Minister.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السكرتير عام الأمم المتحدة، أصحاب السمو المعالي والسعادة، السيدات.
In the name of God, the Merciful, Compassionate Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to express our appreciation at the organization of this session. I thank Saudi Arabia, the African Union and Germany for the coordination and preparation that have made this possible in order that we may help the people of Sudan in this alarming situation. Egypt has brotherly relations with Sudan and is committed to the security and stability of that country, which is our own stability and security. We stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan. We will spare no effort to help the people of Sudan so that they may live in dignity in a country that is secure. We will continue our efforts with all parties in order to end the fighting and ensure a return to dialogue. We recall that regional and international organizations must play a constructive role in that effort so that Sudan may emerge from this difficult situation without limitations applied based on narrow interests. We must save lives and uphold the integrity of Sudan's institutions. Thus, Egypt has held meetings under the auspices of the two countries' leaders in order to optimize distribution of assistance. The conflict is a threat. It brings a risk of a large-scale humanitarian crisis which could spill over the country's borders, bringing consequences to the security and the humanitarian situation in other countries with large-scale displacements. A large number of Sudanese, 850,000, have had to leave their homes and seek refuge in neighboring countries. Sudan should I say, Egypt has always sought a constructive approach to help Sudan emerge from the crisis. Our authorities have spared no effort to allow the people of Sudan to cross the borders and to obtain humanitarian assistance. We have taken in approximately 250,000 Sudanese in our country, about 60% of the displaced persons. And there are some 5 million Sudanese who have chosen to live in our country for decades. We recall the importance of neighborly relationships among brotherly countries. The people of Sudan, in our country, we have taken in large numbers of Sudanese and provided services. I take the opportunity to commend the efforts made by the United Nations working under the Secretary General to assist Egypt in its efforts to support Sudan. This crisis risks to spill over the borders, as I have said, with an impact on the efforts made to host refugees. The lack of humanitarian financing means that assistance is not always provided where needed, and this can compound the regional crisis. From the start of the crisis, Egypt has invested heavily in supporting people who have crossed the border, victims of the conflict, who have come in unprecedented numbers. We have provided some 300,000 tons of humanitarian assistance and taken in approximately 10,000 foreigners among the expatriates who were working in Sudan in humanitarian and diplomatic organizations. We are covering the daily food needs of those who have come to our country. The expenses have reached some $450 million per year. To cover the needs of this 250,000 Sudanese, we recognize the need to guarantee financial resources that will make it possible to implement humanitarian projects and support the host countries. This is crucial in order that there may be peaceful coexistence and combat all risks of exploitation and trafficking. Or indeed become victims of exploitation in terrorist activities. Once more, we recall our commitment to the principles of sovereignty and the importance that we attach to a Sudan that lives in dignity and freedom. We must step up our efforts to support the people of Sudan and end this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Excellency, for your intervention, as well as the important role that is being played by Egypt as a country receiving Sudanese refugees, as well as those fleeing the fighting. Thank you so much. I would now like to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Katja Kohl, Minister of State at the Federal Office of Germany. You have the floor.
Thank you, Excellencies, and thanks to all the humanitarian workers on the ground who try to help people and save lives. We are talking about almost 2 million displaced and hundreds of thousands of persons seeking refuge in neighboring countries. So many people have been uprooted. We are still shocked about recent reports from West Darfur, where people have been attacked and killed just because of their ethnic identity. The senseless eruption of violence made humanitarian assistance in an already challenging environment even more difficult, many times impossible. Before the hostilities broke out, many children could still be reached by humanitarian assistance and get at least a daily meal from the World Food Programme at their kindergartens. This is no longer possible. Considering hundreds of people killed and thousands injured, our #1 priority is evident. The hostilities must end immediately. The parties to the conflict must engage in meaningful talks about a sustainable ceasefire without further delay. Civilians must be protected, always. International humanitarian law and human rights law must be respected, now. Due to the lack of access, we don't know exactly who can benefit from humanitarian assistance today. However, resilience operations have restarted and can hopefully reach as many people as possible. At the onset of conflict, many organizations have been looted. Some have come under crossfire and could barely operate. Humanitarian workers were killed, including 4 WFP staff in Darfur. We will not forget them. Humanitarian access must be ensured. Humanitarian workers must be able to provide life-saving assistance without fearing for their own lives. The Sudanese authorities must remove excessive bureaucratic impediments to the humanitarian operation and issue visa to humanitarian workers without delay. Warring parties must prevent looting and ensure safe passage. The conflict threatens stability and livelihood in the entire region. This is why assistance to vulnerable communities within Sudan and to neighboring countries must be scaled up. It is the countries in the region that are hosting the majority of the displaced in this crisis. We thank those countries for their hospitality, and we will continue to stand by your side in these difficult times. Safe corridors between Sudan and neighboring countries have to be established, and borders must remain open. In this spirit, Germany pledges 200 million euros of humanitarian assistance to Sudan and the region till 2024. 100 million of which are new commitments yet to be allocated, depending on access and the evolving security situation. This is part of our broader commitment to the region, which also comprises 270 million for resilience building and 3 million euros stabilization engagement. The scope of this crisis makes it very clear. We need to join forces to save lives. We encourage others to contribute what they can in response to the humanitarian crisis in Sudan and the region. Every life counts. There are almost 25 million people who are currently dependent on humanitarian assistance for survival. We are closely observing the developments on the ground. The country needs the restoration of political dialogue actively shaped by civilian and civil society. And Germany will continue to stand by the people of Sudan in their aspirations for freedom, peace and justice, and for a democratic Sudan. Thank you for your attention and your engagement.
Thank you, Excellency, for your intervention as well as for the generous pledge of Germany. I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Janusz Lenarčič, European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management. You have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, from each speaker today, we hear of the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in a country that has reached a tipping point. But even before this conflict, Sudan's people faced major crisis, which has now been sent spiraling out of all proportions. In 2022, there were 16 million people in need. Today, The number of children in need alone nearly matches that figure, and the overall number has grown by over 55% to reach 25 million people in need. Across the country, people are facing outbreaks of disease, increased child malnutrition, and the rise in violence of all kinds, including sexual and gender-based violence. We need a sustainable ceasefire, and we urgently need to help the people of Sudan. I will outline 3 ways we can act now to help this desperate situation. First, we need full respect for international humanitarian law by all parties, especially protection of civilians. And it is up to every one of us to demand this of parties to the conflict, as Secretary General Guterres just did at the beginning of our meeting. The European Union welcomes the signature by both parties of the Jeddah Declaration. Now, signatories must ensure its full compliance. Second, we need to ensure safe humanitarian access to Sudan, including to conflict-affected areas and in areas hosting internally displaced people. Sudanese authorities must remove administrative barriers and restrictions on movements so as to allow the return of humanitarian workers. Third, we need more funding. Currently, the UN's humanitarian efforts are funded only by 15%, meaning millions of Sudanese are left abandoned. It is gratifying to see the openness of neighboring countries in accepting Sudanese refugees. As well as closing the funding gap in Sudan, we must also step up our funding to support the host countries. The EU is committed to helping the people of Sudan. In 2022, we doubled our support. And this year, we are increasing our pledge to more than 250 million euros for Sudan and neighboring countries, funding humanitarian, development and stability programs. This, alongside an additional pledge of 226 million euros from EU member states, brings Team Europe's total pledge for Sudan to nearly 500 million euros. But we cannot close the funding gap alone. Therefore, we urgently need similar levels of commitments from other donors according to their capacity. Because supporting people in need is a responsibility the international community must share. I encourage you to plead generously today. The people of Sudan rely on us, and we must not let them down. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Giulio Rakotononirina, Director of Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the African Union Commission. You have the floor. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished representatives. The conflict in Sudan has made the humanitarian situation, which was already disastrous in the region, very much worse. The African Union Commission is very concerned at the information which notes that there are more than 2 million displaced persons and refugees. The African Union Commission continues to urge neighboring states of Sudan that are affected by this emergency situation to keep their borders open. In fact, the neighboring member states are continuing to accept refugees. Despite the generosity of these neighboring states, the African Union Commission is perfectly well aware that this is a real burden, a very large number of refugees and displaced persons. And these states, on top of this, also have to make do with their own limited resources. As regards humanitarian access, the African Union Commission notes that this is one of the main barriers standing in the way of providing humanitarian protection and aid to people in need. In this context, the African Union Commission welcomes the international agreements which lay the foundations for a comprehensive ceasefire, which will allow for the urgent deployment of humanitarian aid. The Commission firmly supports these efforts and welcomes the pledging conference, which should allow for receiving of more resources to meet the humanitarian needs and to meet the needs emerging from the crisis in Sudan. If we think about the humanitarian program, we must ensure that it is in a position to respond to certain situations, including the crisis in Sudan. The 15th Extraordinary Malabo Summit was able to look at efforts being made throughout the country, offering a platform for African Union member states to renew their commitments. This is an unprecedented crisis in Sudan, and there is colossal suffering amongst the Sudanese people. The African Union wishes to show the required leadership, help assist in finding African solutions to these African problems. We seize the opportunity of this meeting to reassure the international community present here that the Commission of the African Union is willing to join the rest of the international community in order to respond to the current crisis. Very many thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Directeur.
Thank you, Director.
To Martin Griffiths, United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Dominique. Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for being here on this important day. I'd like to add my thanks to that of the African Union and the governments of Egypt, Germany, Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the European Union for co-hosting this critical, important event today. The conflict that broke out in Sudan in mid-April has caused unbearable suffering for millions of people across the country. And regrettably, the conflict is intensifying, particularly in Darfur, Khartoum, and Kordofan. Escalating violence and casualties in Darfur are deeply concerning, particularly the hundreds reported killed in the capital of West Darfur, El Geneina, in violence that appears to have an increasingly ethnic dimension. We're similarly alarmed at reports of sexual violence in both Khartoum and Darfur. These criminal acts must end now. Since the start of the conflict, more than 2.1 million people have fled the fighting. Close to 500,000 have crossed into neighboring countries, many of which are already facing their own humanitarian crises. And my colleague, of course, High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, will speak more about the situation for those people and those countries in a moment. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, since my visit to Port Sudan in the first week of May, we have made progress in scaling up the response to those needs incurred by this conflict. Through intensive negotiations anchored in the Declaration of Commitment, supported by our team in Jeddah under the organization of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United States, we have, as a result, coordinated at least 350 truck deliveries, carrying more than 14,000 metric tons of life-saving assistance to different locations across Sudan, including 57 cross-line deliveries. More than 1.8 million people have received some form of assistance in these last 2 months. We're progressively expanding our operational footprint to key hubs, particularly in eastern Sudan. And let me pause here for a moment to express my deepest gratitude and respect to all the aid workers, local organizations, civil society organizations, and people who are putting their lives at risk to help others in Sudan Thank you. I also pay special tribute to the families of the 11 aid workers who lost their lives in this conflict in these weeks. The role of civil society and local communities continues to be of critical importance. They are at the heart of the humanitarian response as first responders and our essential delivery partners. I thank them from the bottom of my heart. We have allocated some $37 million through the Sudan Humanitarian Fund, administered by OCHA, to support the response by civil society partners who are delivering with great courage in priority areas. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, violence, looting, and with a focus on the destruction and looting of humanitarian property continues to hamper the humanitarian response. In Darfur, we're having extraordinary difficulties in reaching the 8.6 million people in need of humanitarian aid and protection. To expand access to people in all areas and to increase the flow of aid, we're actively exploring all modalities, including cross-border operations. I call on the Sudanese authorities and those in neighboring countries to continue to support, permit, facilitate those efforts. And I urge the Sudanese authorities to urgently resolve pending visa applications and denied travel permits, these impediments to effective humanitarian assistance to their people. Parties also must continue and indeed improve their upholding of the commitments agreed under the Jeddah Declaration. We are in a race against time to pre-position supplies before the onset of the rainy season and to distribute seeds before the planting window closes, seeds in the possession of the FAO and which need to be delivered to their point of delivery. If the fighting interferes with the planting season, of course it will compound the already dire food security situation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in addition to causing immense suffering, this conflict is gutting the economy and sending the prices of basic goods soaring. Essential services, especially healthcare, are grinding to a halt in the worst affected areas. So my urgent asks today are as follows. Our humanitarian appeals for the response inside Sudan and the neighboring countries are significantly underfunded. With needs and operating costs soaring, we simply, urgently, and promptly need more resources to fund life-saving assistance. And we know that we can deliver on that assistance were the funds to be made available. To keep urgent humanitarian operations going, at this moment, I am allocating today an additional $22 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to address priority needs. $25 million has already been allocated from the fund to support humanitarian efforts in neighboring countries, where I would particularly draw attention to the fortitude as well as the need of many host communities. Altogether, SURF has contributed $65 million to respond to the crisis this year, but we desperately need your help with additional flexible funding. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, finally, the Sudanese people in the region urgently need an end to this conflict, as has been said by all the speakers. We're closely working with the African Union to support the implementation of the humanitarian component of the African Union roadmap for the resolution of conflict in Sudan. The violence causing so much suffering to civilians, damage to Sudan, must stop now. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffiths, and thank you for the announcement of the SURF pledge, the additional SURF pledge. I would now like to give the floor to Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner for Refugees. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dominique, and greetings all from Nairobi, where I find myself. I can only echo Martin's description of the extremely dire situation inside Sudan. Last night, I spoke with one of my deputies, Raouf Mazou, who is currently in Sudan, together with our team of 45 international and more than 200 national staff. In addition to those newly displaced, and together with UN and NGO partners, they continue to support the more than 1 million refugees from other countries that were hosted in Sudan prior to the conflict. We make progress, but access continues to be difficult, and many are left without support. Almost 2 million people, or close to 2 million people, are now displaced inside Sudan. Looting, killing, and sexual violence are rife, as I heard myself from refugees crossing into Egypt when I visited the Sudanese border a few weeks ago. This must stop. Because on top of the tragedy unfolding in Sudan, the conflict risks spilling over Sudan's borders, with dramatic consequences across the region and beyond. About 500,000 people have already left the country, have already fled the country. We have recorded 365,000 refugees since the onset of this conflict, with Egypt and Chad hosting the majority, but people are also fleeing to other neighboring countries. In addition, many who had sought refuge in Sudan, as I said, prior to the conflict, are now being forced to return home in adverse conditions. In particular, South Sudanese, some 113,000 so far, are going back to their country of origin with absolutely nothing. They're returning to places that are not ready to receive them, putting an additional strain on impoverished communities. These movements risk further destabilizing a country, South Sudan, that is itself trying to emerge from the devastating impact of conflict. The security vacuum created by this violence provides fertile breeding ground for those who traffic in humans and weapons. Both the presidents of Egypt and of the Central African Republic in recent days mentioned their concerns to me in this regard. And I'm sure that the rest of Sudan's neighbors are equally worried. Many have also expressed concern, as we heard, that the violence, the appalling violence in Darfur, could spill over in Chad. UNHCR is working with governments of all neighboring countries, helping them coordinate refugee responses and supporting host communities. A few actions are urgent. First, let me join others who said the same: the fighting must stop. I welcome all efforts being made in this respect. They must continue and be supported on a no-regrets basis, not only for the sake of Sudan, but to prevent further instability in the region and beyond. The current ceasefire must hold. Second, I appreciate the pressure on neighbors. I appreciate, as I said, the security concerns, but at the same time, I appeal to neighboring countries. Please continue to keep your borders open, not just to uphold your legal obligations, but to save lives. Please apply humanity in your approach. Third, as Martin just said, we need more funding for the humanitarian response plan inside Sudan and for the regional refugee response plan coordinated by UNHCR with 140 partners in the neighboring countries. People are fleeing to countries that were already stretched and fragile, 4 of which had already underfunded humanitarian response plans of their own. They need your support to address those pre-existing humanitarian and development needs, as well as much, much more to help those who have fled from Sudan since the 15th of April and who may not stay in neighboring countries if help waits or is insufficient. I also appeal to the World Bank and other financial institutions to reinforce international support through special instruments dedicated to refugees and communities hosting them. We are possibly only days away from the rainy season, which will further exacerbate the suffering of the hundreds of thousands who have fled and limit further our logistical reach in rural and remote areas, for example, in eastern Chad and in the Central African Republic. I saw for myself the dire state in which many Sudanese arrive in Egypt, dehydrated, exhausted, many in desperate need of medical assistance. The needs of refugees are huge and set to worsen, and so are those, as I have also seen in Egypt, of the communities hosting them. But to date, the refugee response plan is just 15% funded. The lack of funds received so far is deeply distressing and has grave consequences on people's lives. Ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow, fittingly, is World Refugee Day. So please give generously and give urgently. So many lives depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for your remarks. I would now like to invite everybody to watch a video of testimonies of affected people and first responders in Sudan. Thank you.
The conflict that erupted in Sudan in April has worsened an already tenuous humanitarian situation.
أثر التأثير شديد بقت نسبة إنه هناك ما في أمان في الخرطوم فإحنا طلعنا عشان أولادنا عشان التعليم وعشان الحياة.
Fighting has driven hundreds of thousands of children, women and men from their homes and cut them off from food, water, education, healthcare and other basic services. In a poultry warehouse in Wad Madani, families have found refuge from shelling in Khartoum, but they are not feeling safer and are worried about the future.
والله حقيقة الوضع مأساوي شديد وجينا لقينا فيها والله كمية من الحشرات حتى فيها عقارب وحصلت لنا حالات بتاعت نتق للعقارب وفيها دبايب.
أول حاجة ما في حمامات حقات استحمام ولا بيت روم بيت العدب ما في الحاجات دي زائد إنه ما في موية إن نحن لو عارفين إنه حنجي نعيش في حتة زي دي أفضل نقعد في بيوتنا يعني الدانة ولا الإهانة زي ما قالوا.
The impact of the crisis is especially felt by women like Mayada, a school teacher who, despite personal hardship, has joined local efforts to bring assistance to those most in need.
معظم الأسرة بتاعتنا سافرت مصر عن طريق الباصات يعني لما طلعنا نسافر حتى ما كان في زول أساسا عشان أنت تودعه وتقول له مع السلامة. حاليا يعني في تعرضات بتاعت في حالات بتاعت اغتصاب الهام حاليا حاصلة ما معنا شاب في البيت عشان نحن نقدر نجيب حاجات من الدكان أو مثلا نمشي حتات بعيدة.
بس حاليا في فترة الحرب شغالة في غرفة طوارئ شرق النيل.
الوضع الجاي حيكون أصعب من كده إذا الناس يعني الوضع ده ستيل حيبقى كده بالطريقة دي الوضع حيكون ماشي لوضع أصعب من كده بكثير.
بنحاول ننسق مع الجهات الممكن تساعدنا بشتى الطرق لكل المواطنين.
التواصل مع القابلات عشان نشوف حوجتهم شنو.
معدتنا دي وحاجاتنا خلاص انتهت. إسعافاتنا بالذات يعني من كانت عندنا هسه لا عندنا كليبسيات لا عندنا بني لا عندنا كتف لا عندنا الإسعافات ذاتها ما عندنا.
Sudanese and international partners continue to deliver and scale up operations despite looting and access constraints. But they can't do this alone. They and the people of Sudan need your support.
ونتمنى إيقاف إطلاق وقف النار ويكون في سلام شامل لكل البلاد.
I hope you appreciated the video. With this video, we conclude the opening segment of this event, and we move to the intervention and announcement segment. We will start the second segment with a special feature in which we hear from the Republic of Sudan and the refugee hosting countries. And I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Adam Bakay Dukri, Minister of Social Development of Sudan. Minister, you have the floor. Minister, we don't hear you. I think you're on mute. If you would like to try and speak and unmute. Maybe in the interest of time, we'll come back to you, Minister, or do you want to, yes, can you, yes, I still can't hear you, so we'll come back to you, Minister. I will hear now from the refugee hosting countries, recognizing that Egypt has delivered their remarks in the opening session. I will now give the floor to Mr. Firmin Gebeng Mokou, Chargé d'Affaires, Permanent Mission of the Central African Republic. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, we can now hear you, Minister. Sorry, first the Central African Republic will come back to you. So please go ahead, Minister. We'll hear you now. We can hear you. Go ahead.
In the name of God, the Almighty, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Mohammed bin Abdurrahman bin Jassim Al Thani, Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sisterly Qatar, Your Excellency Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, Foreign Ministers of Saudi Arabia. Sound is buffering and interpretation will have to stop.
السيد جوليو مساعد مفوض الشؤون الانسانيه الاتحاد الافريقي، السيد فيليبو جراندي المفوض السامي لشؤون اللاجئين، اصحاب المعالي والسعاده الوزراء والسفراء والممثلين في اثاث الدول الصديقه، الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمه الله وبركاته.
All protocols observed. Peace be upon you all. I would like, on behalf of the people and government of the Sudan, to express our deepest appreciation to participating in this high-level event to demonstrate support and solidarity with the Sudanese people. Again, sound has been interrupted. Interpretation will have to stop. Sound is buffering. We are sorry, we cannot continue. The interpreters indicate.
Minister, we're having difficulty during your intervention. The connection keeps on being cut off. Maybe if you could turn off your video, maybe the sound will be improved.
Once again, it's buffering, madam.
المفاوضات الجارية في جدة بين القوات السودانية.
Interpretation cannot continue under these conditions. We are awfully sorry about that.
صالح أعمال إنسانية في السودان واستضافتها عشرات الآلاف من المعتمرين السودانيين منذ شهر رمضان الماضي. كما نشكر دولة قطر
Minister, we're going to have to, I apologize for this, but the interpretation is not able to happen. I would suggest that your ambassador here in the rooms takes over your speech, if that's okay with you, who's sitting here. Thank you. Go ahead.
In the name of God, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellency Mohammed bin Abdurrahman bin Jassim Al Thani, Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Sisterly State of Qatar, Your Excellency Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia, Sisterly Saudi Arabia, Your Excellency Mrs. Sameh Shukri, Foreign Minister of the Sisterly Arab Republic of Egypt, Ms. Annalena Baerbock, from the Foreign Office of Germany, Mr. Martin Griffith, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Philippe Grandi, High Commissioner for Refugees, ladies and gentlemen, peace be upon you all. Allow me at the outset to express, on behalf of the government and people of the Sudan, of our great gratitude and appreciation for participating in this high-level humanitarian event, which paved the way to demonstrate solidarity and support to the Sudanese people during the plight it is going through on the back of the rebellion of the Rapid Support Forces on the 5th of April. They tried to grab the power in the Sudan, a rebellion that had catastrophic repercussions on health, education, and service sectors. We particularly thank the organizers of this humanitarian event. We highly appreciate Egypt for receiving more than 200,000 Sudanese, facilitating the passage and residency within within the Arab Republic of Egypt. We also value the efforts of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the largest evacuation operation by all measures, and for hosting and facilitating ongoing talks between the Sudanese forces and the rebel rapid support forces, in addition to the humanitarian action they undertake in the Sudan, and hosting tens of thousands of pilgrims from the Sudan since Ramadan. We also thank the state of Qatar that have, over the past 2 decades, has supported the stabilization efforts in the Sudan, particularly in Darfur. Qatar spared no effort to provide humanitarian development support to the Sudan and contributing to evacuation efforts. We also wish to thank the Federal Republic of Germany, the European Union, OCHA, and HRC for their continued support and for standing firm by the Sudanese affected by the events and for co-sponsoring this important event. Ladies and gentlemen and high-level representatives, the hostilities and the hostile acts that have been perpetrated and are still being perpetrated by the Rapid Support Forces against civilians and civilian and service institutions, particularly in Khartoum and Darfur, led to more than 2 million persons to flee the areas. This has also exacerbated the situation of the hospitals and medical facilities that have been taken by the rapid support forces as military barracks. They forced civilians out of their homes and looted their properties. This is indeed a systematic pattern of forcible displacement of civilians. Historical, archaeological, and cultural institutions have also been destroyed and sabotaged by these forces. This can be taken as a grave violation of the international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also especially deplore the grave violations of the rebels of the Rapid Support Forces against civilians. Numerous documented reports have indicated and have revealed grave violations of the IHL and IHRL, including acts of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls. Numerous reports have referred to incidents of arrests, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killing and torture, in addition to attacking civilians on their ethnic grounds. We also deplore the heinous crime of abducting and killing the governor of Western Darfur Governorate. The current events forced more than 1.5 million into internal displacement across the Sudan, the largest number of which are being hosted by local communities. The Sudanese, well known for their generosity, have opened their hearts before the doors to the people affected by the events. This is nothing unusual about the Sudanese people who have always opened their doors over years for millions of refugees coming from the neighboring countries or even farther beyond due to armed conflicts and climate change. More than 500,000 people have been forced to cross borders to neighboring countries. We especially thank the Arab Republic of Egypt, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Central Africa for their appreciable cooperation to receive and to create conditions for safe passage of the Sudanese people. We call upon the governments of those sisterly states to cooperate with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to continue opening their borders to those who would like to leave the country and to continue providing the necessary support to the Sudanese residing in their territories and to guarantee their free movement until the current crisis dissipates. Ladies and gentlemen, immediately after the events, the government of the Sudan formed a higher committee for humanitarian affairs comprising all line ministries to assess the humanitarian requirements and to coordinate closely with the relevant United Nations agencies, particularly the United Nations mission in the Sudan and the UNHCR country office, in addition to the other international humanitarian organizations including the ICRC, to respond to the increasing needs. We welcome the exceptional steps taken to provide food, medication, agricultural inputs, and livestock needs, as well as the requirements to address the vaccine. We also welcome the mediation efforts by Saudi Arabia and the United States, based on which the Sudan actively participated in Jeddah talks that led to the signature of Jeddah. The Sudan has also been committed over this period to respecting all humanitarian breaks and ceasefires that we agreed to, despite the other rebel party has not committed as equally. We also wish to welcome the efforts by IGAD to reach a peaceful solution that saves the blood of the Sudanese and guarantees their security and safety. We also wish to affirm the efforts of the quartet headed by His Excellency President Salva Kiir Mayardit in urging the rebel rapid support forces to respond to the voice of conscience and to bury the hatchet and to desist from any acts of violence against the civilians. The High Commission for Humanitarian Affairs have been cooperating through its office in Port Sudan in partnership with the Foreign Ministry of the Sudan and other line institutions to expedite visas to humanitarian workers and to provide passage permits, in addition to the authorizations for landing, for airplane landing and customs exemptions for humanitarian shipments. More than 385 humanitarian workers have been given access to the Sudan. An assessment was made by the United Nations across borders in Chad.
Quickly, thank you.
هذا الصدد أود أن يجدد التزام السودان بمرور.
The Sudan has also been committed to deliver humanitarian deliveries to the affected persons in the Sudan. At the same time, any delay over the past period was primarily a result of the concern by the Sudanese governments for the safety and security of the international workers and protecting the humanitarian supplies from any looting by the rebel rapid support forces. These concerns are being addressed by the authorities in a manner to ensure the safety and security of humanitarian workers. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the states participating in this humanitarian event, I would like to express our deepest appreciation on behalf of the internally displaced Sudanese inside and outside the Sudan for your continued support and for standing firm by the Sudan in these difficult circumstances. We are certain that the outcomes of this high-level event will improve the capabilities of HCR to respond positively towards the internally displaced persons and the forcibly displaced Sudanese in the neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for taking the floor. I would now like to give the floor to the Central African Republic, Mr. Firmin Gabin Beng Mokou, chargé d'affaires de la mission permanente de la République centrafricaine. Vous avez
Central African Republic Permanent Mission. You have the floor. Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants. At the outset, on behalf of my country, I thank the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees for this commitment and for the support to the regional response plan for refugees from the Sudan. The violence in Sudan is, of course, affecting the south of Darfur and the whole of the region. It is being isolated from our country. Our government is highly aware of the crisis in Sudan and wishes to express compassion to the people of Sudan. Since April, we have seen some 15,000 persons coming to our country, including our own nationals who have spontaneously come back to our country, fleeing the violence. Asylum seekers and returnees are reaching a region which had one of the most severe levels of vulnerability of our country. We have an operational basis in Amdafok, providing some physical protection to the persons arriving, but given its remoteness and the lack of infrastructure, services and resources are limited, and it depends highly on the trade routes from Sudan, which have been interrupted, leading to price rises and a lack of food and fuels. For example, certain products such as sugar have seen their price double. The region is remote because of the poor roads and difficult security conditions. The 65 kilometers away, there is a town with a reasonable operational presence. Working with the authorities, our humanitarian partners are trying to relocate the refugees. The evaluation mission by HCR identified an urgent need for food, water, shelter, and basic essentials to ensure that the people arriving can survive. The logistical challenges are very difficult because of the remoteness from our capital and the difficulty with road transport, which can take up to a month during the rainy season because of the low level of infrastructure and the security difficulties. To ensure that the people in need can be properly helped and in timely fashion, the only effective alternative is by air, with high cost in the context of a lack of fuel. This leads to a rise in humanitarian costs. Partners are having to readjust their calculations within the 2023 response plan. To meet the urgent needs of it is $533 that are now required. To mobilize these, our government is launching an urgent appeal for international solidarity in order to ensure that people fleeing Sudan can have access to asylum and protection services, as well as multi-sectoral assistance at border points and consular and return assistance for third country nationals working with the relevant consular services. Secondly, we must identify, including through registration activities, people who are at risk and vulnerable people and provide them with necessary assistance. Thirdly, we must support the resettlement of refugees far from the border in safe areas for appropriate resettlement of large numbers of persons. And fourthly, our authorities seek to facilitate reintegration of our own citizens, including those who were refugees in Sudan and who have returned in very difficult circumstances. Working with the child protection activities, we have set up facilities for children in a safe environment to ensure the children's well-being. Partners must also invest in prevention, mitigation and response to gender-based violence, ensuring that survivors have access to the relevant quality services and that they have security and health care. Listening centres must be established to provide psychological support to survivors. In terms of education, the humanitarian response plan must make it possible to ensure a rapid return to learning for refugees. Education partners must work with the national authorities to support access to school enrollment for persons displaced from Sudan, including expanding existing schools in order to take in additional pupils. Refugees, recent arrivals, have an urgent need for humanitarian assistance, and food security partners have pointed to available stocks, but must facilitate distribution, giving priority to women, children and girls. As regards the most vulnerable persons among the third country nationals, we must work with consulate in order to provide them with the possibility of returning to their country of origin. Mobilization of member states is crucial in order to meet these goals. My country, more than ever, needs international solidarity in order effectively to rise to this combination of challenges. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Central African Republic representative. I would like to remind all participants that you have 4 minutes for neighboring countries, and for other speakers it is 2 minutes. We're trying to keep to our schedule because we're already spilling over. With that, I would like to give the floor to Madeleine Allingué, the Secretary of State.
Perspective and International Partnerships, Chad. Sorry for doing English and French. So over to you, Her Excellency.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. On behalf of the government of Chad, I wish to express our warm thanks to the United Nations, the government of Egypt, Germany, Qatar, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as the African Union and European Union for organizing this important event. Chad is one of the countries seriously affected by the Sudan crisis. We thank you for this opportunity to speak. With the complication of various factors, the crisis in Sudan exploded on 15th of April this year, with immediate repercussions in the region. For Chad, we see ourselves as closely aligned with Sudan, geographically, in human terms, in social terms, in cultural terms. Sudan borders with us. It is a fraternal country. In order to find safety and refuge, it is natural that over 135,000 people from Sudan came to Chad, in Wadai province, in Sila, and in Wadifira. Our government responded immediately. In security terms, our defense forces were mobilized immediately, sending over 6,500 men and 700 vehicles to the border. In addition to civilians arriving as refugees, coordination saw over 400 military personnel arriving in vehicles. They have been sent to local areas and are being provided with food and shelter by our army. The coordination identified a number of weapons in the hands of civilians. Medicines have been sent to the area to support the new arrivals. In social and environmental terms, our communities are showing considerable generosity, hosting refugees who are putting additional pressure on scant natural resources. Our communities do not have much in terms of social services, and there is considerable pressure on the available resources, which are overloaded. In terms of schools, health centres, roads and other infrastructure, the burden is heavy. We have had over 600,000 refugees in our territory since the turn of the century. We are now seeing 135,000 new people arriving, further unbalancing the demography of the area and leading to tensions. The east of Chad has provinces which are very vulnerable to climate issues and in structural terms frequently see food crises. Currently, the movement of refugees to safer areas follows impact studies carried out by a number of ministries, including environment, water, agriculture, security, childhood education, and economy ministries. In economic terms, the east of Chad is traditionally an important economic area. It produces food, dates, and other commodities, road transport, and the caravans moving through the north of our country to Libya are also an economic activity for the zone. With the closure of the borders with Sudan, access to transboundary services and products is cut off. The instability in Sudan has a catastrophic impact on the economy of the area, which is already facing many difficulties. As you also know, Chad is in phase 2 of political transition, stepping up efforts in order to address its geopolitical situation. In institutional and legal terms, we have adopted and ratified the law on asylum. That was May 2023, and have adopted the law on the Kampala Convention. We are setting up a national humanitarian cooperation framework, and we have a management committee, an ad hoc Chad-Sudan committee, in order to resolve issues affecting the borders. On behalf of my government and the communities facing this crisis, we are happy to note that all those present here share the same vision and the same will, as well as the same shared sense of responsibility. We come today to tell you the cost of this to Chad. We are calculating on the basis of the long-term and mid-term forecasts with ongoing migration, cyclical migration on all of our borders with Libya, Sudan, and Cameroon, caused by violent extremism, community conflicts, natural disasters, and climate change, inter alia. We add our own IDPs and our low level of economic development. In view of all of these costs, and investment which would be fair and comprehensive is required, and we call on you to commit to developing Chad and the region. This would reduce the risks and the vulnerabilities of people, making them more resilient. We need better international aid governance with greater awareness, better coordination, and greater and more flexible financing. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam. I thank you for your statement.
Give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Tsigab Kebebe Daka, the Permanent Representative of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia. You have the floor, and I remind you it's 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I want to join others who spoke before me in thanking the co-conveners of the High-Level Pledging Conference. I want to make the following 4 brief points. Number 1, on the peace process, we believe that the Sudanese people have enough wisdom and capacity to solve the current crisis facing the country. We are confident enough that the brotherly people of Sudan will find a Sudanese solution to regain peace and order. Partners should support the political process involving regional organizations, that is African Union and IGAD, aimed at ending the hostilities, de-escalating the situation, and ensuring the protection of civilians. The reformulated Quartet of Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Sudan is expected to facilitate the peace process in Sudan. To this end, I want to reaffirm the commitment of the government of Ethiopia to the conflict in Sudan, to peaceful resolution of the conflict in Sudan based on the principle of subsidiarity. I also want to underscore the importance of national ownership of the peace process and the need to avoid proliferation of initiatives. Number two, Ethiopia is deeply concerned over the deteriorating security and humanitarian conditions in Sudan due to the ongoing conflict. Before the eruption of the conflict, the humanitarian needs across Sudan reached record levels. That is, nearly 16 million people, about a third of the total population, requires humanitarian assistance. Meanwhile, the revised 2023 Humanitarian Response Plan for Sudan, launched on 17 May, requests US $2.56 billion, targeting 18.1 million people. Sudan is in a difficult situation, therefore it's imperative to stand with the people of Sudan by providing additional and timely humanitarian assistance. Number three, not only Sudan but also its neighbors are hugely affected due to the increased humanitarian needs resulting from the conflict as a result of the cross-border displacement of close to 500,000 refugees, asylum seekers, and returnees who have already fled to neighboring countries. The Regional Refugee Response Plan, launched in May, projected that some 85,000 people in need of international protection will enter Ethiopia within 6 months. It also projected 100,000 Ethiopian migrant returnees and 30,000 third country nationals will enter to Ethiopia. So far, over 45,000 people have entered Ethiopia from Sudan, and our borders remain open. Number four, government of Ethiopia is providing life-saving humanitarian assistance as well as material support to the people who have crossed into our borders. The continued underfunding, however, is compromising our efforts and is aggravating the situation. The new arrivals from Sudan puts additional pressure on my country, which hosts over 1 million refugees. As of June 15, only 24% of UNHCR Ethiopia financial requirements is funded to respond to the refugee situation in Ethiopia. Hence, while thanking partners for their generous support, I want to underscore the need for additional financial resources to meet the urgent needs of the new arrivals from Sudan. Responding to the needs at early stage will have a paramount advantage, and efficient and timely funding is critically needed to support the people of concern. I would thus like to call upon partners to support those communities to respond to the growing needs based on the revised Humanitarian Response Plan and Regional Refugee Response Plan for Sudan. I want to conclude my remark by affirming the firm and unwavering commitment of the government of Ethiopia to support the people of Sudan to resolve the conflict. I thank you.
Wow, I think we should applaud the permanent representative of Ethiopia under 4 minutes. Congratulations. Thank you very much for your intervention and for keeping your borders open. I would now like to give the floor to Ambassador Alier Deng from South Sudan. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Allow me at the outset to convey the greetings and best wishes of His Excellency President Salva Kiir Mayardit and our Acting Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. The Republic of South Sudan would like to thank, I also add my voice to the previous speakers, to thank and appreciate the organizers of this important conference, which comes at a very difficult time for our region with the aim to support the humanitarian response in Sudan and the region. Indeed, the crisis in Sudan resulted in the displacement of the people from their homes and has caused acute food shortage and health problems, as well as the loss of many lives and properties of the people in Sudan. South Sudan has been keeping its border open for accommodating, receiving, and welcoming South Sudanese returnees, Sudanese, and other nationals affected by this crisis. The impact of this crisis is greater on South Sudan. The majority of those arriving, 75%, are women and children. South Sudanese returnees are over hundreds of thousands who have been in Sudan, of which a large number of them are stranded in Upper Nile state, and they need to continue their journey inwards. The crisis has also impacted the economic. Prices has risen to a very high level. Sudanese refugees are mainly in Awil, Ruweng, Unity, and Upper Nile areas. The number of nationals from third countries is about 130,000, mainly from Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. Many of these new arrivals will be going to communities that are already very fragile due to a mix of conflicts, food insecurity, and climate change, which require redoubling support to state and local authorities that will need to come up with innovative solutions and facilitation to the newcomers. South Sudan has opened 12 crossing points at the borders for Sudanese and other nationals to enter without visas. Madam Moderator, the humanitarian situation is dire and catastrophic, and it requires urgent attention. South Sudan calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities and urge for urgent opening of humanitarian corridors to allow civilian parties in Sudan to bring the current conflict in Sudan to an end. We commend and support the regional mediation efforts of IGAD, supported by the African Union, and we welcome the recent adopted IGAD's roadmap for the resolution of the conflict in Sudan. South Sudan strongly believed that it is high time for the international community and donors to show solidarity and to sufficiently respond to the pressing humanitarian needs in Sudan and neighboring countries impacted by the crisis. In conclusion, it has to be recalled that the government of the Republic of South Sudan continues to facilitate humanitarian agencies with a view to easing their operations as they carry out assistance to the affected population. Therefore, as a part of the humanitarian response, I would like to assure the OSHA that my government is committed to supporting humanitarian action. I thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Deng, for your intervention and for keeping your borders open. I would now like to invite you to watch a video of testimonies from Sudanese, but also refugees hosted in Sudan that were forced to flee to neighboring countries. Thank you.
ودي هناك صعب هسه حاليا ذاته الضرب شغال ليه هسه حاليا السودان بقت قاعد مرة واحدة
نقعد نشتغل هنا نخرفه زارت كمان نرجع في مهننا كم روح فيه
أعطيتها كمان نتنها شيء وزكي إسبيتها كنت نستدل مرة نصنف لما
وفي اطفال ما لاقين وجبات يعني كل هسه فقط هسه عنده سوء تغذيه في خلال كم يوم 20 يوم اذا كان نازل واصل على شهر او شهر ونص هيحصل انه في سوء تغذيه كثير لانه كله عدم الوجبه وعدم الغذاء كامل لكل الاطفال.
شفت يا انا جيت بيباير بس ويا لي زول بهدم واحد في واحد طلعنا جينا قفلنا باب بس جينا فاحنا من جينا الرن هنا الرن شالونا جابونا هنا جينا قلنا يمكن محل يكون افضل من هناك او جينا هسه قاعدين في الشمس تعب شديد
أماكن اللي عمرتهم قالوا كان أبيها يعني جركي أرنجك وكسين يعني أي جاني مش شغالك أرنجك وكسين أرنجك في أي تواني
Thank you very much. I now turn to Your Excellencies and distinguished guests for interventions. I'd like to kindly remind and request that each statement are kept to 2 minutes to allow enough time for all our speakers. We have a long list to get through. So with no further ado, I shall now give the floor to Ms. Samantha Power, USAID Administrator by video.
Last month, I traveled to eastern Chad to visit Sudanese refugees who escaped the violence in their home country. I heard stories of separations from friends and loved ones, intense hunger and thirst, stories of husbands murdered by militia, of mothers walking, in one instance, for 22 days, holding a baby burning with fever. Stories of Sudanese armed elements trying to extort displaced persons and refugees, some of whom are fleeing violence for the third or even fourth time. The United States continues to call on the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to cease the violence that is creating this devastating humanitarian crisis. Violence that doesn't just affect communities, but intentionally targets aid convoys and humanitarian workers, many of whom are Sudanese themselves. The leaders of these forces must put down their weapons and abide by their existing commitments to protect humanitarian workers and their own people. In the absence of peace, we are working to support the Sudanese people, whose lives and families are caught in the crossfire. Since conflict broke out, U.S. government teams and our partners have been working around the clock to deliver essential food, water, medicine, and shelter to those displaced by the violence. But much more needs to be done. Right now, only 16% of the humanitarian needs in Sudan identified by the United Nations have been funded, leaving humanitarian response workers without the financial resources that they need to meet what are increasingly dire needs. So today, I am pleased to announce that the United States government is contributing $171 million in additional funding, bringing our total support for Sudanese displaced and refugee communities to more than $550 million in the current fiscal year. We feel privileged to be able to contribute in this way, but right now more than half of the funding for the humanitarian response has come from the United States, and this is simply not sustainable. So I would like to make 2 appeals to our partner governments. First, even amid what we know are acute needs all around the world, please look to make new pledges today and in the coming days. And second, please fund those pledges as quickly as possible, with a speed that meets the urgency of this moment. The humanitarian crisis is spiraling out of control, and while the perpetrators of this conflict bear responsibility for it, right now, bureaucracy on the ground is itself causing harm and even costing lives by limiting the good that humanitarian actors can do. Imported emergency food supplies right now are being held up at customs. Aid workers often can't get visas that would allow them to be part of delivering assistance. Most supplies are only permitted to enter the country at Port Sudan, forcing aid convoys to traverse long, dangerous distances to reach communities in need. I want to close by urging the Sudanese authorities to move far more swiftly and aggressively to remove the severe bureaucratic and security restrictions that are hindering shipments of life-saving aid, so that the money pledged here today and in future days can have the greatest possible impact. Let's come together to prevent widespread hunger, to save lives, and to help the people of Sudan who wanted nothing more than a peaceful democratic future. We must support them at their moment of greatest need.
I'd like to thank the U.S. representative and also for their pledge and generosity. I would now like to invite the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Iceland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Excellencies, distinguished guests. The conflict in Sudan has already had disastrous consequences for the Sudanese people, as well as wide-ranging implications far beyond the country's borders. It is painful to witness the large-scale displacement, both inside Sudan and to neighboring countries. Increasing reports of rape and sexual violence perpetrated against those internally displaced are deeply disturbing. Crucial life-saving efforts by the UN and the wider humanitarian community, including local actors, are admirable, especially in the context of incredibly complex operational environment. It is critical that these efforts are scaled up, which calls for additional humanitarian funding, both for those operating inside Sudan and the neighboring refugee-hosting countries. Against that background, I am pleased to announce an additional contribution to the UNHCR of 50 million Icelandic krona in support of the agency's life-saving humanitarian and protection mandate in Sudan and the vital. Obstruction by parties to the conflict cannot be tolerated. They must respect and uphold international humanitarian law. The people of Sudan deserve a political solution to the conflict, a solution.
For your generosity, I would now like to give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia.
On behalf of the Australian people, who are deeply distressed by the loss of life and destruction that is taking place in Sudan, the Australian Government extends our condolences to the people of Sudan and the Sudanese community around the world. We call on all parties to agree to a permanent cessation of hostilities and to work towards civilian-led democratic governance in Sudan. About 24.7 million people, nearly half the population of Sudan, need humanitarian aid and protection. Over 2 million people have been displaced since the conflict began, fleeing to safer locations inside and outside the country. This is putting unprecedented strain on a region already dealing with an historic drought. Millions of people remain without access to services including healthcare. A catastrophic food crisis is looming. And yet the fighting continues. The Australian Government will provide this will be directed through the International Committee of the Red Cross, and that money will be used to provide immediate relief, including medical supplies, food, water and sanitation, emergency shelter and protection for the most vulnerable people affected by the crisis. I can also confirm that Australia will provide $5 million to the UNHCR, which is delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance in the region. We urge all parties to the conflict to uphold international law and protect civilians, including health and humanitarian aid workers. It is essential that humanitarian agencies are given safe access to deliver life-saving assistance to the people of Sudan. Finally, I want to emphasise that the humanitarian assistance we all pledge today can help to ease the immediate suffering, but a negotiated political solution is the only path forward for the people of Sudan.
Thank you, Australia, for your pledge and for your intervention. We appreciate it.